All right, hello and welcome everybody to another episode of The Big Three on CPA TV. As always, my name is Mihir Torsekar, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host and fellow economist at CPA, Andrew Rechenberg. And together we are here to talk to you all about the Big Three trade topics happening this week. So let's get to it.
Let's go!
So for those of you who are familiar with our format, Andrew and I are usually talking about the big three, but today we decided we'd deviate from the usual way of doing things by bringing on Nick Iacovella, our executive vice president, to talk a little bit more about why CPA is such a strong proponent of tariffs, but also to help moderate a discussion around tariffs in general, and some to help kind of dispel some of the myths out there about tariffs, whether they cause inflation, whether they'll, tank the manufacturing sector, whatever myths that are out there. And we felt like this would be a good time to be able to have this discussion. It's been about 9 months since we've seen the president, unveil a series of tariffs, whether it's under the IEEPA tariffs or Section 232. So it's a good chance for us to debrief and level set. So to start out with, I'm going to turn it over to Nick, but I first want Nick to talk a little bit about CPA, like why we support tariffs, why we believe that these are sound policies. So Nick, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mihir. CPA really was founded in the post-China PNTR, era where our country had vastly deindustrialized. We offshored millions of jobs. Our industrial capacity had cratered, and there was a group of manufacturing members who decided, the status quo is not benefiting the country. It's not benefiting American workers, and long term, it's going to be bad for the country. So that was, almost 20 years ago that CPA was founded, and if we fast forward, clearly the era of free trade is over. We now know that we have a growing bipartisan consensus that free trade has not brought the benefits that people told us that it would. We can, discuss this, of course, when we look at things like, NAFTA, PNTR, some of the trade deals where these benefits were promised to us. And so what we focus on, of course, is trade, tax, industrial policy, and tariffs. And we believe tariffs can be a very important tool in the toolbox to reshore domestic production, to raise revenue, like with the president's universal tariffs. And so that's really a cornerstone of CPA's work, is our trade policy. And that means that we are unapologetically pro-tariff. The evidence is clear. We've seen what people want to say about tariffs, and, I'm happy that we're going to cover, these myths today. But again, tariffs are one of the most effective tools the U.S. has to reindustrialize. And something I'm so proud of our team for doing. Yes, we make economic projections. We revisit those to make sure that we're as accurate as possible. We want to have an honest discussion. But something we're also incredibly adept at doing, thanks to the work of you guys, is explaining to people, here's what's happening in the economy. We don't need to look back and say, what did the Tax Foundation or Cato or, the Peterson Institute tell us, the projections of all these bad things will happen. We have the data. Let's look and see. And when we look at the data, we actually can tell a great story about tariffs. And I think, that really brings us to, myth number one that we're going to be discussing today. But, I think let's start right off. Myth number one, tariffs cause inflation and economic disaster. We have heard from the time that Trump was in office the first time during Trump 1, clearly he set about an entirely new agenda of implementing tariffs. And then when he won the general election last year, again, we heard economists saying this is going to be a disaster, the president's tariff agenda. He implemented the tariffs, on Liberation Day. He has an incredibly aggressive 232 agenda. So I think we can explain to folks, what that is. But just tell us, are some of these predictions that we've heard obviously wildly, aggressive and saying how bad tariffs would be? What does the data actually tell us? What are we seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that
You can't really overstate how much of a disaster a lot of the famous economists on the free trade side have been predicting these tariffs will be. There are some that are literally comparing it to depression level economic disaster. And you see quotes like this from people like Justin Wolfers. And then we also see people like Jeremy Siegel from the Wharton Finance School talking about how this is the worst policy mistake in 95 years. But
Crazy.
the economic reality is that this is not what's happening at all. If this is really a Great Depression level mistake, we would not be seeing inflation at only 2.9%. We saw much, much higher inflation rates only just a few years ago. In 2022, the average inflation rate was 8%. And this was not after any major tariffs or anything like that. And it just goes to show that tariffs are not what drives inflation. The money supply, credit creation, these big shifts in the money flow in the economy, that's really what drives inflation. And if tariffs were such a disaster, we would have been seeing tariffs at much higher levels. But the reality is that while inflation has increased slightly over the past couple months, it hasn't really increased that much at all. And so just in August, for example, it increased 0.2%. This is a very marginal increase, and overall year over year inflation at 2.9% in August is still below January levels. So before even Trump implemented any of these tariffs, before any of them were implemented with the reciprocal or any of the new Section 232 after Trump won, this inflation was higher in January than it is right now. And so we're really just not seeing this economic disaster. And the main reason behind this is that imports are just not that big of a share of our total economy. When you look at the total goods imports that the US takes in as a percent of GDP, it's only about 11% of GDP. And so it's really not that significant share of our economy. It's not going to move the needle one way or another. The vast majority of our economy is domestic. It's domestic services, domestic goods, domestic production. And that's also why we favor tariffs, because we want to protect this vast majority share of our economy that is here in the United States. And we don't want to give up any extra ground to imports. We've seen a lot of losses in the past couple decades, but we want to, that's for the exact reason that we want to defend this major share, is also why imports aren't going to move the inflation needle either way.
Yeah, and that's a great point that you make, Andrew. I think, you and Mihir as the econ team have done a great job of explaining what actually drives growth in the U.S. economy. The same crowd that's anti-tariff also in the same breath will tell us, instead of having tariffs, what the president should be doing is going to do more free trade deals. We don't need higher tariffs on imports. What we need is everybody else to lower their tariffs. And we have this, great kumbaya, rainbow and butterfly and unicorns of free trade all over the world. And American workers are going to have, incredible prosperity because of that. This is what they would have us believe. Of course, this has never happened ever in the history of any of these deals, but maybe just talk to us a little bit about that, because it's why we place so much emphasis on, the domestic producers meeting more of the demand in the domestic market.
Well, I mean, I think part of it is to your point, Nick, about the utopia that so many people have envisioned about, this cooperation and let's just to take you back through history. I mean, 1947, around the time when the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade came out, and that set us on the course to start reducing tariffs and eventually spawned the WTO in 1995. And there was it was born out of this idea that post World War II, that what we needed was more opportunities for collaboration and cooperation, and that economic, or commercial connections, commercial transactions, if we would facilitate that would sort of, mollify certain tensions, geopolitical tensions, and that we would have this kind of kumbaya type moment. And I think nothing sort of encapsulates the maybe failure of that decision than our decision to welcome and support China's admission into the World Trade Organization in 2001. And that has really set us on the course. I mean, that really accelerated the decline of U.S. manufacturing. And yet, to your point, I mean, the same people who were touting this model that has not materialized, in fact, the exact opposite has happened, still continue to put out these ideas, put out these economic models that are flawed. And I think when we've talked offline about this, what's the percentage of accuracy? What's the accuracy rate of some of these models?
I think this
Nick? Why don't
this
you
is
tell us
important
that?
for people to understand. I talk to reporters about this all the time. The anti-tariff crowd, the evidence that they use to say why tariffs are bad is always some economic modeling prediction. And when you dig into the nuts and bolts of the models that they're using, they make assumptions that are just insane. One of them is the economy is at full employment. So we could never add jobs in the economy. We are at peak capacity. The other one that I find so incredibly fascinating that, we don't call this out more is that domestic production is stable. Well, it can't increase. So in other words, we could never have a tariff increase domestic production. And of course, we know the real world evidence is the exact opposite of that. The US ITC did a study in 2023 on Trump's tariffs and found that every single tariff that had every industry that had a tariff imposed had increased domestic production as a result. Those economists that made all those predictions, of course, they never went back and said, let me reflect a little bit about what I put out there, and see now that we have the actual data, how close was I to what happened? Because then the jig is up, right? This is not economic, this isn't economics is what they're doing. They're doing political advocacy. Yep. These are the same people that told us what PNTR imports from China would only increase 7% in those first few years, right? They were wrong by a factor of 7. Never did they self-reflect on that. So, I think it's incredibly important for us to keep pointing out not only why what they predict is wrong because we have the data, but let's have a more honest discussion about how they're even reaching these conclusions, in the first place.
Yeah, well, I'll also point out another.
And it's 0%, by the way. You asked the question.
Yeah.
The Minneapolis Federal Reserve, they studied these models, right? And they came out with the study. One of the pieces of it was the correlation from real world data to prediction is 0.0. And I remember asking our chief economist emeritus, Jeff Ferry, who's helped, spearhead and start so much of this great work that you guys have really grabbed the torch and carried on. I said, Jeff, tell it to me in the for dummies, explanation. And he said, well, it means that there's a 0% chance that it's correct. It has 0% advocacy. And that's actually what the Fed said, essentially zero predictive accuracy. So...
Yeah, well, they also, I think another assumption of the models is that investment is either fixed or it's not mobile. And we know that that when tariffs in the real world, when tariffs have been imposed just recently, like, for example, steel tariffs, Section 232 tariffs that have been in place since 2018 and have recently been ratcheted up to 50%. We are now witnessing the biggest investment underway in steel, in the steel industry. 21 million metric tons that have either been announced or are planned to be brought online that have, over the past 4 years or so, as a result of these tariffs, because now our folks can compete against some of the folks like China who have, subsidized unfairly and unfairly priced their steel industry. So again, we can understand like why these models are so flawed.
And we're going to cover that in myth number 3, what actually happens to manufacturers. But first, I think we obviously had a ton of economic news this week, right? The Fed cut interest rates, for the first time. A lot of people in the market have been saying that they're way late on cutting interest rates. The Fed has said, for months that they're worried about inflation. And so that was a reason that they weren't going to cut interest rates. And those very same people that are saying tariffs are causing inflation, they're really not saying, well, inflation must not be that big of an issue if the Fed is cutting interest rates. And something I think post-COVID, we saw, massive inflation and for all sorts of reasons, right? I mean, we've discussed this, a huge injection of money supply to the economy. the COVID, supply chain crises. I mean, things just got more expensive. We couldn't ship them. All were leading to the impact of increasing inflation. But that sort of left a really bad, experience for most people when they had these prices drastically rising. And the anti-tariff crowd has been so quick to say, let's use that fear to tell people that tariffs are so bad so that when they go to the store, they think, I bought a pair of running shoes that cost $100. Well, because of Trump's tariffs now, 20% tariffs, those shoes are going to cost $120, or $124. That's not the case. That's not how tariffs work in the economy. But let's address this myth number 2. Tariff costs are passed directly to consumers. And I hear this all the time. Tariffs are a tax on the American consumer. If we have $200 billion in new tariffs, that means that we just levied a $200 billion tax on everyday American consumers. We've never seen this in economic data ever, but people still say that this is going to happen. So help us explain what's going on, because obviously we've had some price increases recently. And when we look into those, there's no tariffs applied on them, or, it's a crop where there's a disease, for example. So, here, Andrew, help us address this. Are they really passed on to consumers? What's going on?
Yeah, and I think that that's definitely the assumption that a lot of these major economists on the free trade side want you to make. They want you to assume that anytime you see a price increase after a tariff's been increased, that it's going to be related, even if it's not at all. But they want you to give you this impression. And actually, speaking of Jeff Ferry, in a debate with Jeff Ferry, Scott Lincombe from the Cato Institute, he was making this direct implication that saying that 95% of tariff costs are put directly onto consumers. And other famous economists have said similar things, that the tens and billions of dollars that we've been raising in tariff revenue, that's also going to be passed down to consumers. But this really isn't what we're seeing in practice. And before we get into the actual numbers, it's easy to explain with the shoe example that you just said, is the tariff costs aren't just going to be exactly 20% or 50% or whatever the tariff is on that sticker price you pay at the store. Because really what it's doing is that it's putting a tax when it's imported from foreign manufacturers. So if you're buying something that was made in the US, there's no cost increase whatsoever. And then even if you are having a tariff and a tax on something that's being imported, that's not the whole sticker price as well, because this $100 for a pair of shoes, for example, some of that is the foreign manufacturer cost, but a lot of it is other processes, such as it's going to be the rent in the store that you're buying the shoe from. It's going to be the wages of the workers in that store selling the shoe to you. It's going to be the warehousing costs of storing that shoe before it gets to the store, or even the transportation costs of it getting there. And so once you have all these other costs factored in, the actual tariff increase on the shoe is not going to impact the price that much. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the data. So when you really dig into the August data and what is pushing inflation up, these marginal amounts month to month, it's not tariff-related goods. The number one driver, according to the BLS themselves, is shelter, and it's housing costs. And this is not your rent's not going to go up or down within a few months just because of tariffs. This is long-term consequences of U.S. housing policy, us having housing shortages, zoning laws, while there being
Do mortgage
still
rates
strong
impact
demand.
that at all too?
Absolutely. And so
This could be
rates,
something that the Fed is seeing. Shelter costs are high, mortgage rates are high. It's time for us to cut rates.
Absolutely. And I think that that's really how we should be viewing the Fed cutting rates as well, is that there's this assumption that if the Fed cuts rates, it's going to be inflationary because it's introducing new money into the economy. But the important distinction is, how is this money that's being injected in the economy being used? If it's being used on the consumption side, if it's being used to buy cars or to buy rents or stuff like that, that is more money that's going to be more inflationary. But if this new money coming into the economy is going towards new houses being built, or if it's going towards businesses investing in production, then this money can actually be de-inflationary because it goes to the supply side of things. And so it's really not this black and white that if you lower interest rates, it's going to be inflationary. A lot of this money can and will be used to actually increase domestic production and unlock this potential that we have. And so I think that's really essential in the long-term housing situation, that if we want new housing stock, we're going to have lower rates to actually encourage this new building over time and make that cheaper.
And what about some of these industries where we do have very high tariffs, right? Like electronics, for example. I know Apple just came out with some new iPhones. Mihir, we were discussing the other day, I think a handheld game system, that you've been on the hook for buying once again.
Yep. Yeah.
But if we had tariffs that were causing price increases at the consumer level, shouldn't we expect to see price increases in these areas where there's high tariffs? And the data isn't showing that. Walk us through that.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's exactly the main point to take away here. Just because just that statutory rate, everyone fixates on that and assumes that, oh man, that's going to affect what I pay at the register. Mm-hmm. But the truth is, as Andrew said, that cost can get refracted throughout the supply chain and just in multiple ways. And when we talk about the Nintendo Switch example, or whether we're talking about Japanese automobiles, for example, things like that, like currency fluctuations, can also impact the cost that we pay as consumers. So, for example, the Nintendo Switch is a perfect example. The cost has actually stayed the same despite the tariffs, right? It's still very expensive, but it's apparently very quality. My 11-year-old would tell you it's amazing, but that's beside the point. To talk about the Japanese automobiles, right? So the automobiles in yen when priced in yen have declined by about 26%. So, again, so that means that the U.S. consumer, I mean, in dollar terms, it's relatively stable, but it's not to say that a 15% tariff on Japanese cars now redounds to that consumer in the way of a 15% increase in the sticker price, right? It's just disingenuous to suggest that. The other thing I'll point out is that, when we look at, for example, these assumptions about how the tariff is going to, when you impose a tariff, it's going to go immediately hit those downstream consumers. And when we talk about the ITC study, for example, when we look at 2018 and the tariffs that were imposed, 25% for steel, I think 10% for aluminum. When you look at the downstream effect, y'all can remember if I'm correct on this, but I think it was a 0.7% increase for downstream consumers of steel inputs, right? So if we're then going to pivot to then say, well, see, there you go, that's an increase. The consumer pays that, we're in trouble. Are we going to say that, or are we going to say, well, you were telling me that it was going to be this 25% increase, but why was it so small? Why is it such a fraction of it? And I think it's also worth considering, retailers, Walmarts, Home Depots, Amazons, etc. They have more pricing power than ever before, and they're able to squeeze some of their suppliers, and they're able to say, look, we want you to, narrow your cost a little bit. And let me also mention recently the budget bill, I guess we call it the big, beautiful bill.
Yeah, the reconciliation bill.
Something like $100 billion in tax revenue or tax savings that go to businesses can help that are projected for this year as a result of that bill, could help some of those businesses absorb some of the cost of the tariff or help defray some of the cost of the tariff so they can shield the consumer from that. And so we're seeing a lot of this happening at the same time. And that accounts for why we're not seeing this huge spike in inflation. And yet, to your point, Nick and Andrew, it's like the narrative hasn't changed. It's almost like, well, just wait and see. Right. Well, we're 9 months into the Trump presidency. We've been waiting. When is the point? How long have we waited? Or how long do we need to wait, I guess, is the question.
Well, and that's the dirty secret in DC, about the economics profession is, again, if it's a Wall Street economist who's betting on inflation, I do talk to Wall Street economists. They do not tell me that Trump's tariffs are going to cause rampant inflation. The reason why is because if they told their firm that, and they made, hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars of bets on that being accurate, they'd be wrong and they'd be fired because they lost money. In DC, it doesn't work like that. There's no, self-reflection on, was I actually accurate? This is paid political advocacy. They're paid to be anti-tariff and paid to make these claims. And so, I think we will keep pointing that out. But I do want to play a little devil's advocate because we've read a lot about grocery prices, right? We've seen grocery prices are rising. And of course, we've seen the anti-tariff crowd say, well, look, that's the impact of Trump tariff policy, more expensive at the grocery store. But then, of course, we dig into the data and we say, well, let's take some of these products and see what's happening. So that's a concern for people. I do hear it. Help us explain what's really going on. If you're watching, if you say my grocery prices are rising, I've been told, it's because of Trump's tariffs. Well, we say that's not actually true. And of course, we have the data. So tell us why. Walk us through that.
Yeah, I think it's really important to recognize when these prices are increasing because we are seeing higher grocery prices. But once you dig into the data and you separate out what's actually tariff related and trade dependent and what's not, then you see a completely different picture. So some of the biggest drivers of grocery store prices increasing, number one, lately it's been beef. Beef prices are going up quite a lot. But as far as import reliance, the biggest countries where we have beef imports from are Mexico and Canada. And then any beef coming from Mexico or Canada is covered under USMCA and comes in tariff free. So tariffs are not hitting our beef imports. What's really happening here is screwworm outbreak. And so there's been a big screwworm disease outbreak in Mexico that has halted a lot of imports coming into the US. And because we've been so reliant on imports, our domestic cattle herd has been shrinking year after year, and it's at record lows at this point. And so we've given up this domestic supply, this domestic resilience of our own supply for these imports. And right now we're paying the consequences not of tariffs, but for a reliance on these imports because we can't control the sanitary and health practices in a country like Mexico as much as we can control it here. And so we have to restrict it at some point, and that's why we're seeing an increase, not because of tariffs, but because we're reliant on this high-risk import supply, just as we are with a lot of different goods. Another great example of this is one of the highest grocery store prices that we've seen, as a lot of you know, is eggs. Eggs are up over 10% in price over the last year. But this price increase started before even tariffs happened because of an avian flu outbreak. These are the main things, these big supply shocks that affect both domestic and foreign supply, that affects pretty much entire global prices, as we're seeing with coffee now because of a bad coffee harvest. That's another great example. These big supply shocks that affect global prices of these grocery store items, that's what moves the needle on inflation, not just a few percentage tariffs on this item or that item. That's not going to move the needle. And that's what we're also seeing for items that are really reliant on imports, such as olive oil or a lot of pasta coming from Italy. We had these retaliatory tariffs on these items, but they're essentially unchanged. There's a lot of competition in this space. People don't want to give up their market share, and so they'll easily absorb these tariff price shocks.
I'm still buying the Italian reds. So
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, no, that's a great point Andrew makes about the competition and the relative the premium that's placed on certain items, and I think that also affects pass through as well. So we talked a little bit earlier about shoes. Like if we're talking about shoes from China, basic athletic shoes, you can find ready suppliers for that. So that's a scenario in which we'd see probably a relatively low pass through for consumers. But again, we're talking about Italian pasta, throw in Italian wine, which is a luxury item. And consumers might actually face a little bit more of an expensive, just because they're paying for a premium on something that's not readily substitutable. So that's also worth considering.
And this talk about really being so, vulnerable to supply because we have lessened our domestic output, in things like beef, for example. That really gets us to myth number 3, which is, at CPA, we say we should use tariffs for revenue and protection, right? We should raise revenue with something like universal tariff. We've seen the success already of that this year, sort of record revenue. And then for protection, we very much believe that tariffs are an essential piece of the toolbox to reshore domestic production. Of course, the anti-tariff crowd actually tells us the opposite. They want us to believe that if we impose tariffs, U.S. manufacturers are going to be hurt. So myth number 3, tariffs crush U.S. manufacturers by raising input costs. I hear this all the time. If we impose a tariff, then U.S. manufacturers are going to be worse off. They're going to be less competitive. Of course, the answer, the solution that's provided is we should pursue export opportunities. We should have more free trade deals. I think if you all could just cover this, what's going on with this myth here? What's the data telling us? There's so much emphasis on CPI, But, explain to people what the PPI number is, maybe what those two numbers are. And then separately, do exports matter? We hear this all the time from the free trade crowd. What role do exports even play in the U.S. economy? And how much of this should we provide emphasis on? So, help us walk through this.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is also an argument we see from a lot of major economists. Jason Furman, for example, who was the CEA chair under Obama, made this exact argument that if we have tariffs on different items that are inputs for US manufacturers, that's going to make them less competitive, both domestically and in the global market. And he used steel as an input for the auto manufacturers as a specific example. And this is actually a great example to the contrary, though, because at this point we have years of evidence of what the steel tariffs have actually done for U.S. auto manufacturers, and it has not affected their PPI, which is their producer price index, basically their production costs. It hasn't really not moved the needle much at all. And when you look at the overall,
if PPI is going up, that basically means that things are getting more expensive for a manufacturer to produce, right? Is that the basic reading of it? Got it.
Exactly, yeah.
Yep.
It's a measure of their production costs, and so that's why PPI is so important. It's often an early signal for CPI, the overall inflation that consumers end up paying, because if it's more expensive for a producer to make something, they're ultimately going to pass things on to consumers because it's harder for them to make it. But if the PPI is going down, if it's cheaper or the same for producers to make something, that signals the price is not going to increase. And that gets us to what we're seeing here in August. And the PPI, the producer price index in August, actually went down. So it's cheaper. It actually is less over a year for these producers to make something in August. And so this is a great signal moving forward. It shows that this is a signal that inflation, the CPI, is not going to be ramping up in the next couple months. And it also shows that these input costs that these economists are worrying about, the steel inputs for US manufacturers, for example, they're not going up also. And this is exactly what we're seeing. Steel and aluminum prices are about on average with inflation. The producer price index is actually going down. And this is really just dispelling all of these myths that it's going to impact inflation. And the signal is actually going negative, that inflation's not going to be increasing much at all. It's going to start cooling based on this PPI if this trend continues.
Yeah, I think it also gets to the argument about just how much of the inputs of like steel and aluminum, for example, go into things like, automobiles or even beverage cans. We heard a lot of consternation back in 2018 about, oh my God, your beer is going to get so it's so
You're
expensive.
You're not going to afford a 12-pack anymore.
Right. They're not throwing out these fears about, your Diet Coke is going to get super expensive. Your beer is going to get. That's the kind of message that gets people like really worried and like hot under the collar. But it's like we're talking about cents here. We're talking about whether automobiles. We're talking about less than 1% of the cost here too. So it's also worth putting this in perspective about what kind of cost. Even if there was a full pass through, which we know there isn't. It would be a relatively marginal effect, I think.
Yeah, and I think a great reality check for a lot of people in looking at this argument is, well, if this was true, what the economists are saying, that inputs make production cheaper and everything like that, or even offshoring makes things cheaper, but reshoring, having tariffs is inflationary. If you assume that's true, then the opposite would also be true, that once we did offshore all this auto manufacturing, when all the car manufacturing moved to Mexico, our electronics moved to China, did our cars get cheaper over the past 2 decades? I wouldn't say so. Everything's gotten more expensive. And so the opposite isn't true. We're not seeing what they are saying is true happening now. And so it's really just being disproved from all different angles.
That's a great point about automotive manufacturing. I heard a story from a friend that works in the Trump administration where one of the officials in the admin was talking to one of the CEOs of one of the big 3 automakers. And, the auto CEO was upset about the proposed 232 tariffs because, we definitely have a North American, sort of a center of production, right? Thanks to NAFTA, and even USMCA. And, President Trump has said, we want to bring this production back to the U.S., not just North America, but here to the U.S. And, the CEO is saying, well, that's just not going to be possible. And the Trump official said, well, why? Is it because things are going to get more expensive? Just tell me why. And the question that was asked was, when you guys move production from, you close facilities in the US and you move production to Mexico, what price of which car did you lower for the US market? And
Right.
the answer is none.
Yeah.
And so, we hear this all the time. We can't move stuff back to the US because it's just not possible, and the reason for offshoring is consumers are going to benefit. Well, where were the price decreases? And what did we sacrifice because of that? We lost thousands of jobs, and it's not just the jobs that supported the communities, that supported the families. It's the tax revenue. It's, a manufacturing job at worst case has a multiplier effect of 7 to 15 jobs, throughout the economy. So we lose that. This is never, of course, discussed with the anti-tariff crowd, but I think, thank you guys for keep pointing it out. It's so important, and also too, the other most important piece of this, tariffs to reshore domestic production works. And I think that's the biggest takeaway. This last myth is absolutely false, and we have the data to prove it. We've seen time and time again when we do have adequate protection and incentives, we know companies will make investments in the U.S. We know that those investments will be fruitful and they'll be very beneficial to the U.S. economy.
I'll just give another example of how the interplay of all these policies, the convergence, can all work in practice, or in theory, I guess. So, you've got 232s on steel, like shipbuilding, other sectors like that, right? So when we talk about steel, for example, right, if you're bringing on other customers like through these 232s and you're trying to like regenerate, reindustrialize these sectors, those are customers for the steel industry. Now that they can boost their capacity utilization, that gives them the freedom to then lower production costs, right? Because you're spreading your fixed costs over a broader customer base. It's a volumetric based business. So the more businesses that the more sales that you generate, that also gives you the opportunity to go to a shipbuilder and say, look, if I can lock you in for a 3-year contract or something like that, then we can fix your price. So regardless of whatever the policy shifts that are underway, we'll fix your price. So that a fixed price is the exact opposite of inflation, right? So that gets at the idea of whether these policies are going to be inflationary or not. The certainty with which folks tell you that it's going to be inflationary when they're not even accounting for the nuance and, again, the interplay, the dynamic effect of some of these policies that, again, the multiplier effect that redounds throughout the supply chain. These are all factors that get completely washed away when we go in with a bludgeon and just say, no, these policies are going to do this. That's it. It's a certainty. Done. Right. So that's also something that's really missing from this discussion.
Well, thank you guys. I know that was a lot of information, but I think it's incredibly important. We're out there each and every day trying to show people this is what the data is telling us. This is why we support these policies. And of course, we are oftentimes a lone voice or one of the few, against the many who are decrying tariffs. But the data is on our side, and we'll keep doing what we do. So thank you guys so much for letting me crash the party this week and help discuss, what are the 3 myths on tariffs and inflation? Are they impacting consumers? Are they impacting manufacturers? And we'll keep covering these topics. So thank you so much.
All right, thanks, Nick, for joining us. We'll see you guys next week for another installment of the Big 3 on CPA TV. Till then, take care.